Tonight, an extraordinary conversation with three foreign policy giants. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, and former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. I interviewed them in New York yesterday evening at an event organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The conversation took place at the Rainbow Room, high above Rockefeller Center here in New York. New president comes to power in 2008, as he or she will. What ought to be the most important message that person can say in their inaugural address about America and the world?
I think that we are a part of the world, that we want to cooperate with the world. We are not the dominant power in the world that everyone falls in behind us, but we want to reach out and cooperate. After all, we're the ones that set up the League of Nations, the UN, NATO. That's the way we do business. That's the way we want to do business. We want to work with friends, with allies, with people of goodwill to make this a better world. That's the message.
I think the next president should say to the world that the United States wants to be part of the solution to its problems, not in part the maker of their problems. I think the president has to say very credibly and forcefully to the American people that to do that, what I just said, the American people have to think hard about their definition of the meaning of the good life, that a hedonistic, materialistic society at high levels of consumption, increasing social inequality, is not a society that can be part of the solution of the world's problems.
I think when the new president is inaugurated, we will have gone through 2 years of self-flagellation. And I think he should step up there with some confidence and say, here are problems we see in the world. We would like to listen to a lot of other countries about what they think should be done. He should not pretend that he has all the answers.
Kissinger, Scowcroft, Brzezinski for the hour. Funding for Charlie Rose has been provided by the following.
For every drop of yourself you give, get every drop back. We offer over 80 ways to hydrate, energize, nourish, relax, or enjoy every drop of life.
Additional funding for Charlie Rose was also provided by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide. From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
We are at the top of Manhattan at the Rainbow Room this evening for a conversation about the future of American foreign policy with Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, former National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor, and Brent Scowcroft, former National Security Advisor. I want to begin this conversation with Henry Kissinger with this question, in which I hope everybody will respond to. Where are we as we think about this time in American foreign policy? Are we at a special moment which is being redefined? Are we creating a new world order? What are the forces shaping all this?
We're at a moment when the international system is in a period of change like we haven't seen for several hundred years. In some parts of the world, the nation state on which the existing international system was based is either giving up its traditional aspects, like in Europe, or as in the Middle East, where it was never really fully established, it is no longer the defining element. So in those two parts of the world, there is tremendous adjustment in traditional concepts. In Asia, the nation state still is extremely vital. And of course, then in Africa, a whole new pattern is emerging, because the states in Africa reflected the preferences of the colonial powers when they were established. So all of these things are occurring simultaneously, and American foreign policy has to deal with all these aspects simultaneously, and there isn't a single recipe that fits all of them, and that is one of our dilemmas. And another is that we are used to dealing with problems that have a solution and that can be solved in a finite period. But we are at the beginning of a long period of adjustment that does not have a clear-cut terminal point, and in which our wisdom and sophistication and understanding is has to be one of the key elements. And so all of these things are in play at this moment.
Zbig, you said to me in a conversation last night on my program that there is a new global political awareness, which is central to the future of America's foreign policy, how they recognize it, how they deal with it, how they plan for it.
That's right. I don't disagree with what Henry said, but I guess
Agree?
I don't disagree.
Okay.
But my perspective is a little...
I'm doing well. I've made great progress.
Don't be too optimistic. The program isn't over yet.
I take what I can get.
Don't get too excited, he said. The caveat comes.
The political awakening that is happening worldwide is a major challenge for America, because it means that the world is much more restless, it's stirring, it has aspirations which are not easily satisfied, and if America is to lead, it has to relate itself somehow to these new, lively, intense political aspirations which make our age so different from even the recent past. But the challenge that we face is rooted much more in the immediate problem which we have partially created. Namely, we are the #1 superpower today in the world. We're the only superpower. But our leadership is being tested in the Middle East. And some of the things that we have done in the Middle East are contributing to a potential explosion region-wide. And if that explosion gets out of hand, we may end up being bogged down for many years to come in a conflict that will be profoundly damaging to our capacity to exercise our power, to address the problems implicit in this global awakening. And we may face a world in which much of the world turns away from us, seeks its own equilibrium, but probably slides into a growing chaos. So I think we're at a very critical stage, and I am personally very worried as to what might conceivably happen in the next 20 months. I'm more optimistic after 2008, but the question is, will there be a chance to make a turn and a change?
Let me understand what you think might happen in the next 20 months that could have a profound influence on these ideas we're discussing.
Well, to be perfectly specific, the Israeli-Palestinian problem becomes very acute, with Gaza dominated by Hamas, with the possibility of the conflict escalating, not only in terms of Gaza, but also the Hezbollah and Lebanon, with a continuing crisis in Iraq, which is very dynamic and unpredictable, and which could get out of hand, and maybe even escalate and enlarge. Just think of what happened barely 6 weeks ago between the Iranians and the British, and the sailors that were captured. Suppose there had been American Marines and they hadn't allowed themselves to be captured. I think we could have had a situation in which the president, rightly in my view, announces retaliatory action,
He would have had no choice.
he would have no choice, and I would support it. But that would then lead to other consequences, and before too long, we could be involved in a conflict in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And there are some American statesmen who are publicly advocating American military action against Iran.
Brent, as I suggested, you presided over the end of the Cold War, along with the president you worked for and members of that administration, also the '91 war, which was successful because of coalition building and other issues. How do you see the moment we are at now? Because it is fair to say, everyone knows you've been a critic of aspects of this war.
I think along the lines of what my colleagues have said, this is a very different world. There are forces at work which are new, like Zbig calls it political awakening. What has happened is that information technology has politicized the world's population. For most of mankind, the average person knew what was happening in his own village and the next one, and nothing beyond that, and he didn't care. So that leaders were able to guide their countries almost irrespective of what people really thought, because they weren't involved in it. Now, everybody knows what's happening instantaneously. Everybody is within reach of a television set. And so they're all politicized, and they're all stimulated, and they have these desires, pleasures, hates, resentments, and so on, and they're reacting instantaneously. I'm not saying that's a cause of terrorism, but it certainly inflames it. Secondly, you ask, are we stronger or weaker? The traditional measures of strength don't really apply so much.
Military, economic.
Military and economic, and we're stronger than any probably since the Roman Empire. But we can't do what used to be done with that kind of strength.
Why is that?
Because national borders are eroding, because of the growth of non-state actors. It's a different kind of a world. We are tied down by a tiny little country, Iraq. It's amazing, given the disparity in military, economic strength. It's a world where most of the big problems spill over national boundaries. And there are new kinds of actors. And we're feeling our way as to how to deal with them. I think it is less policy-oriented than Zbig indicated. I think it's more systemic.
Do we need to pay attention to America's credibility? Do you all agree it's suffered because of Iraq and other issues, and therefore it has to be addressed, or can it simply be addressed by doing the right thing on a range of issues?
The important thing is to do the right thing. Then credibility will follow.
Just to add what Henry said in historical terms, perhaps the most troubling area of the world goes from the Balkans through the Middle East and in Central Asia. Right. If you look at the world's last empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and the Russian and Soviet Empire in Central Asia.
If there's a war, that's where it's going to happen.
Yeah. And now these peoples are trying to discover who they are. Their boundaries are artificial. Their historical relationships are very different from what they are now. They're trying to discover who they are and to whom they belong.
You talk about that global Balkan struggle.
That's right. Well, I think there's a further dimension to it. And I think Brent is quite right in focusing on that geographic part of the world.
It really runs from the Suez Canal all the way over to the border of China, for sure. Brings in India, Pakistan, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, as well as Turkey, India, Pakistan.
I call that the global Balkans, because in some ways it's similar to the European Balkans, which were internally conflicted, but had a suction effect on major powers. And that whole region is having that effect. And I think we are really facing, as a country, a real risk of becoming bogged down in this larger spectrum of the global Balkans. And if we get bogged down, two things will happen. First of all, we're going to be largely alone. Most of the world will not be with us. A few client states, but that's all. And secondly, our global power will gradually be dissipated. Our global standing will be undermined. So we do face a very serious strategic historical challenge which we need to think through and regarding which we need to draw some lessons and be willing to change course.
Okay, let me go, Henry, but the lessons are what?
The lessons are that acting alone in a world that's alive and politically stirring is to condemn oneself to isolation and probably protracted warfare of a kind that can be dissipating. The kind of problem that we face in Iraq is a little bit the kind of problem that Israel faced in dealing with Hezbollah. And in the conflict, the theater of conflict enlarges, it's going to become more and more absorbing and more costly.
The question is, what does one mean by getting bogged down? We are there now, and consequences flow from that. In principle, one can say one shouldn't act alone, but once one is in the situation in which we are in Iraq, we cannot simply solve it by saying we should not get bogged down. Spig and I have been putting on a performance on weekly television, and so we have the script fairly well rehearsed. And the issue really comes down.
Yeah.
The issue really comes down.
This is mainly only about Iraq.
How do we disengage from being the only power involved here? Can we simply pull out of there, or do we need a process of transition during which other countries get involved in the negotiating process and in trying to find a solution? There are other countries, for example India, who have a great deal at stake in the radicalization of the Islamic world. So we are now there, and simply withdrawing, this is the real issue between Zbig and me, which I was hoping we would not get to here.
And I was hoping we would.
I know it. I know that. But that is the real issue. And my view is that we cannot conduct a debate about speed of withdrawal. We have to conduct a debate about what it is that we want to create there, to what extent an interplay of diplomatic and military actions can achieve it. And there, Zbig and I have different judgments.
All right, well, let's have those judgments out, and then let Brent be the arbiter of who's right.
I'd be happy to.
All right, but let me understand. I'm serious, though. This is a serious question because of the resumes here are clear, and the respect among each other is clear. So what is it that we need to understand?
All right. Well, first of all, one has to be willing to face the fact that what has transpired in Iraq is not exactly a very successful exercise.
But I don't think anybody disagrees with that, do they?
No, but it's important to reaffirm that, right, because that is exactly a symptom of being bogged down. And a willingness to acknowledge that helps to act as a restraint on a repetition of it elsewhere.
Like Iran?
Like Iran. And there are people in this country, not Henry, but there are some people in this country who are urging that. And we could stumble into that unless we're very alert to the risk involved. But now, on that conflict itself, I think there is a legitimate question regarding how do we extricate ourselves. And it doesn't involve, in my judgment, just packing up bags and leaving, but a willingness to face the fact that this was not a very constructive enterprise is more likely to make us more committed to the notion of terminating the conflict, or finding a formula for the Iraqis and for the region which enables us to disengage and avoid a repetition elsewhere. So there is a real choice here, a strategic choice, and I think we have to be very conscious of it.
I think there's nothing more dangerous than mislearning lessons of history, and we do it perpetually. After the 30s, we said no more Munichs, and it got us in a lot of problems. Then we said no more Vietnams. Now if we say no more Iraqs, the next one won't be in Iraq, it will be something different. You can't learn lessons.
Now, wait a second. That's a gross oversimplification. I am perfectly willing to say no more Iraqs, which means no more unilateral starting of a war on false claims, false information, and a complete misunderstanding of the nature of the situation in the region.
Well, you know, we're not going to have another one exactly that way. But the real point is now that we are where we are. And if we spend all of our time wringing our hands about how we got there,
it's not a question of wringing
instead
hands.
of what we do, and I think now to say we're bogged down, so let's unbog and pull out.
No, I didn't say let's unbog and pull out. I said let's address the issue of how we deal with the Iraqis and how we deal with the region, recognizing the fact that this is a misadventure which it is in our interest to terminate and not to repeat. That's a rather important conclusion to draw from a very unfortunate historical experience.
It seems to me you're saying we need to learn the lessons of history.
That's right. Exactly.
Rather than not
and not disregard them. I don't think Vietnam was such a happy experience either, frankly.